Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 16th of December 2013, Conor Rogerson discussed HIV and whether it could soon be a thing of the past.
Evening everyone. So my name is Conor Rogerson. I'm a student at Newcastle University studying biochemistry. The reason I'm giving this talk is switch the mic off. The reason I'm giving this talk is just to give an idea of the current situation of HIV. And really in the past year there's been quite a few cure stories regarding HIV. So I would like to get your opinions on whether these are actually cures. I've had a look at the literature for this for these cures and come to my own conclusions, but I would like to get your opinion as well. Current situation of HIV is, in the UK, it's about 187 deaths per year in 3 million worldwide. And compared to worldwide, it doesn't sound that much, but that's probably because in the UK we have quite a good education about HIV. In other places in the world where they lack this education is South Africa, where many people go through lives with HIV, pass it on to their children, and unfortunately die. Current medication for HIV are antiretroviral drugs, which basically block the virus from replicating within the body, but these patients still have HIV and are still classed as HIV positive. Another form of medication is proteases, which then block the cleavage of proteins, of proviral proteins, so these T cells cannot make the HIV virus. Now I'd like to go a bit into the immunology of HIV. So HIV binds to CD4 plus T helper cells, which sounds horrific, but it is just an immune system cell which helps in normal bacterial infections, viral infections. And the CD4 receptor is an endogenous receptor, so the body uses this receptor to evade infections. Now HIV binds onto this, gets internalized into the cell. Being the pesky blighter it is, it inserts its genome into the cell's own chromosomes, and then once this T cell is activated, the cell itself produces more HIV virus. So once you're infected with HIV, you are in essence creating more HIV and infecting yourself. Now, the reason HIV is so difficult to treat is because HIV is basically putting a mirror in front of it. So once in these cells, the immune system recognizes these cells as their own cells. Now, a fully functioning immune system doesn't attack these cells. So the immune system doesn't deal with these cells that have HIV in because they think it's fine. But we do have an immune response to HIV. Now, anyone who has any background in immunology know that HIV are internalized by cells called macrophages by phagocytosis. And they basically chop up the virus and then produce proteins on the surface of these cells. The T cells then bind onto these proteins and go through hypermutation, all this stuff, and then they are able to recognize any antigens for HIV. So the immune system is able to rid the blood and other bodily fluids of HIV, but the problem is we still have a latent infection in these T cells. So that's what the scientists and researchers are trying to tackle. So, anything. Now, HIV virus leads to AIDS. And not to confuse anyone, the AIDS virus is HIV, and some newspapers like to call HIV the AIDS virus incorrectly. But how people get AIDS is basically the T cells that are infected with HIV are defunct and can't function. So a gradual decline of T cells over the years then leads the person to have acquired immunodeficiency disease, and these patients don't die from the HIV infection, they die from secondary infections such as tuberculosis, which is a main problem in HIV positive people. Now let's move on to the so-called cures. I don't know if anyone's heard of the Berlin patient, Timothy Brown. He was the first person to be cured of HIV. He developed HIV in the 1990s, and in the 1990s, diagnosis of HIV would be a death sentence. Not like today, where it's classed as a chronic disease now. People with HIV live till 60s, 70s, but obviously have to take retroviral drugs for the rest of their life. Now, a double whammy, Timothy Brown got cancer. So he had to get a bone marrow transplant, but the scientist Gero Hutter in Berlin, hence Berlin patient, alarm bells start ringing in his ears. Now he was doing research on certain mutations in another receptor that HIV latches onto called CCR5. Now a mutation in CCR5 was present in the bone marrow donor. So his bone marrow was transferred into Timothy Brown's, So the new immune system cells that he was producing had this mutation. So HIV basically couldn't infect his new cells. They tested him year after year, and he still lives HIV free. Now, he is the only person that I know today to have been infected, to be cured of HIV, in my mind. I've read the literature and they conclude that there's very, very strong evidence that this man is actually cured of HIV. In the paper I read that there is a high number of activated T cells, which suggests that he is still fighting the infection, a few virions wandering around somewhere in his body. But in essence, he can't pass on HIV, therefore he is cured. A story in March 2003 of this year reported that a young girl was born with HIV. So she was immediately, 30 hours after birth, put on intense retroviral drugs, which doesn't sound nice. But 18 months after of constant treatment, regular tests showed that HIV couldn't be detected with the strongest possible test from her blood. But the mother actually took away the child, because obviously not nice having the child in hospital every day, having those retroviral drugs injected into her. So the mother took her away from this treatment, and the treatment stopped for 5 months. So the clinician then thought that might be a good idea to track this patient down, see what's going on with her infection. And 5 months after she was taken away from treatment, she had her blood tested and no HIV was found. And this got the scientists scratching their heads, because they were just like, well, surely there should have been HIV, because the retroviral drugs don't get rid of the latent infection. But in the literature, they concluded that because it was a young child and the immune system hasn't developed into a mature immune system yet, which is what HIV has evolved to attack, HIV wasn't able to fully infect, and the retroviral drugs here was actually able to cure the girl. Now, obviously, retroviral drugs in normal adults is basically a functional treatment that doesn't allow for the transmission of HIV, but the person still has HIV+. I tried to track down some recent research about this girl, but I think the last test she had was about 6 months ago, and she remained HIV free. So, but they're reluctant to call it a cure. They just refer it to as a functional cure, as in this girl may or may not have HIV, but she definitely cannot pass it on. Now, I don't know if anyone read the Telegraph story about HIV in May of this year, but they reported that Danish scientists said that they were on a brink of a full cure. Now, I had a look at their literature, and they suggested that to tackle the latency of the HIV infection, they would find compounds to activate these T cells to get rid of the reservoirs within those T cells. Now, the results of this show that the reservoir level was reduced by around 12 or 13%. So there is evidence that this technique is working, but it is definitely not a cure. As in, the people of these trials still have HIV, and to my knowledge still do today. So what newspapers like to do is jump on the word cure, so they can get the crown and be like, we reported this first. But aside to this talk, what I'm trying to do is get you to form your own critical opinion of the stories out there. Now, people without a scientific background normally just like to take a step back from all these scientific words and just accept what science is. But a role of students, academics, I believe, is to engage with society and try and get an everyday person to form their own opinion. Now, I've tried to have a look at what the current approaches to HIV treatment are, and I found that we don't have a vaccine, but what we want from a vaccine is antibodies towards the CD4 receptor. So these antibodies would basically cover the virus and not allow this virus to interact with the CD4 receptors on the T cells, and hence no infection. This has worked in vitro, but hasn't worked in vivo. Now, no one knows why. Maybe the antibodies get degraded. There's current research into why that's not working, but because this hasn't worked, people have went down different ways, different pathways, and people are now trying to produce their own anti-CD4 antibodies synthetically. So they make a CD4-like compound which would bind to HIV viruses and act as the antibody and basically neutralize the virus. Another way into this is for a small molecule to fit into the groove onto CD4, maybe form a conformational change, and that way not allow HIV infection. Today, the National Institute of Medical Research tweeted some research about HIV, had a look into that, and they were doing research on accessory genes. Now, HIV have accessory genes which enable them to overcome some other proteins in the immune system that might tackle HIV indirectly. So what they're trying to do is develop compounds, maybe introduce some siRNA to downregulate the production of these genes to help to evade the HIV infection. Now, so in conclusion, we are getting there. Everyone has taken their own little niche of research into what they believe would be the best treatment for HIV individuals. HIV is now a chronic disease, so people getting diagnosed with HIV, it's not a death sentence as it was in the 80s and 90s. It is now a chronic disease. People are living lives to the fullest, but obviously taking drugs every day, so it's not that great. But my main message is the media love to latch on to the C word being cure, and just once you read a story about science, but different from HIV, just take a step back, see what their message is getting across, maybe delve into the literature if you're savvy enough, and just form your own opinion and not just trust what the reporter says. And that's me. Thank you very much for coming, and I've enjoyed this thoroughly.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.